So I'm going to get started. Let's continue with Chapter 2 of the Silmarillion of Aule and Yavanna. Now, Aule and Yavanna are two of the Valar. They are also husband and wife. So, bye TikTok. Thank you for joining. Follow on Twitch if you don't already. We're live there now. All right, what's up? Now that's just us. Am I gonna do the Gollum voice? Not right now, Pudding Cup. I will probably do that a little bit later. Maybe when I read, maybe I'll read through the original trilogy or do some Gollum readings. Witchy Lil Brat, thank you for the sub. Very kind of you. Sundance Kid, thank you for the cheer. Y'all are very, very kind today. Thank you. Right. Welcome to Silmarillion Sunday. Let's get started with Chapter 2 of the Silmarillion. I'll take questions in a few minutes and explain some of the weirder parts. Chapter 2 of Aule and Yavanna. It is told that in the beginning the dwarves were made by Aule in the darkness of Middle-earth. For so greatly did Aule desire the coming of the children meaning the elves, to have learners to whom he could teach his lore and his craft, that he was unwilling to await the fulfillment of the designs of Iluvatar. And Aule made the dwarves, even as they still are, because the forms of the children who were to come were unclear in his mind. And because the power of Melkor was yet over the earth, and he wished, therefore, that they should be strong and unyielding. But fearing that other Valar might blame his work, he wrought in secret, and he made the first of the 7 fathers of the dwarves in the hall under the mountain in Middle-earth. Y'all, this is the creation of the dwarves. This is the dwarf story. Get ready. Now Iluvatar knew what was done, and in the very hour that Aule's work was complete, and he was pleased, and he began to instruct the dwarves in the speech that he had devised for them, Iluvatar spoke to him. And Aule heard his voice and was silent. And the voice of Iluvatar said to him, "Why hast thou done this? Why dost thou attempt a thing which thou knowest is beyond thy power and thy authority? For thou hast from me, as a gift, thy own being only, and no more. And therefore the creature of thy hand and mind can live only by that being, moving when thou thinkest to move them, and if thy thought be elsewhere, standing idle. Is that what thy desire?" So I'll pause there briefly. I explained in a video I made on TikTok, but the Valar cannot create life, and that is what Melkor, the antagonist of the Silmarillion, wants. But it is also what Aule, one of the good Valar, does. And in doing so, he creates life, but not life as we understand it. I say it is something like an unintentional slave. And I think I said that in the video as well. To Aule, the dwarves would only be able to move when he wants them to. And when he's not thinking about the dwarves, then they don't exist. They are just standing there. And it was a very, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing what Aule did, but Aule did something without really understanding what he wanted to do. And I think the big difference between Melkor wanting to create life and Aule wanting to create life is that Aule sort of understands, oh, maybe I messed up. Let's continue. Then Aule answered, "I did not desire much lordship. I desired things other than I am, to love and to teach them, so that they too might perceive the beauty of Ea." Those are the letters E-A, and that is the physical world that Eru created. To love and to teach them, so that they too might perceive the beauty of Ea, which thou hast caused to be. For it seems to me that there is great room in Arda, for many things that might rejoice in it. Yet it is for the most part empty still, and dumb. And in my impatience I have fallen into folly. Yet the making of things is in my heart from my own making by thee. And the children of little understanding that make a play of the deeds of his father may do so without mockery, without thought of mockery, but because he is the son of his father. But what shall I do now, so that thou be not angry with me forever? As a child to his father I offer to thee these things, the work of my hands which thou hast made. Do with them what thou wilt. But should I not rather destroy the works of my presumptions? Then Aule took up a great hammer to smite the dwarves. And he wept. But Iluvatar had compassion upon Aule and his desire because of his humility. And the dwarves shrank from the hammer and were afraid. And they bowed down their heads and they begged for mercy. And the voice of Iluvatar said to Aule, Thy offer I accept, even as it was made. Dost thou not see that these things have now a life of their own, and speak with their own voice? Else why would not have flinched from thy blow, nor from any command of thy will? Then Aule cast down his hammer and was glad, and he gave thanks to Iluvatar, saying, May Eru bless my works and amend it. But Iluvatar spoke again and said, Even as I gave being to the thoughts of the Ainur at the beginning of the world. And remember, the Ainur are like the lesser beings, lower than God. Even as I gave being to the thoughts of the Ainur at the beginning of the world, so now I have taken up thy desire and given to it a place therein. But in no other way will I amend thy handiwork, and as thou hast made it, so shall it be. But I will not suffer this, that these should come before the firstborn of my design, meaning the elves, nor that thy impatience should be rewarded. They shall sleep now in the darkness under stone, and shall not come forth until the firstborn have awakened upon the earth. And until that time thou and they shall wait, even though long it seem. But when the time comes I will awaken them, and they shall be to thee as children, and often strife shall arise between thine and mine, the children of my adoption and the children of my choice. So if you saw my video about it, I'll pause there for a second. Feel free to ask some questions in the comments section below. If you saw that video about the origin of the dwarves, that is the longer, more explained version. It is literally a version of the creation of the dwarves, where one of the lesser gods, Aule, creates the dwarves. Can I turn my audio up a bit? Oh, I just muted myself. Hang on. How's this? Is this any better? Is this a little better? All right. Was there... So yes, this is where I got the information from that video. It's spiking a bit that way. Turn it back down a hair. All right, we're gonna get the audio. There we go. How about 8? Yep. That good? Okay, cool. I'll try and keep it consistent. I'm still learning a lot of this, so feel free to ask some comments down in the questions below. We just saw the creation of the dwarves. Yes, that was the video I filmed live. Jared, you are absolutely right. Yes, I filmed that video live in front of, I think, like 20 or 30 people here on Twitch. So if you saw... Oh, is the audio spiking now? Sorry, people are saying. I saw some comments about audio. Let me know if I need to change anything. Again, I'm still learning about all of this. Is Gandalf a kind of demigod? Gandalf is what's known as a Maya, who is kind of like a lesser spirit than the Valar. So it goes God, then the Ainur and the Valar and the Maiar are just below them. So yeah, I would say demigod is a fair way. Yeah, ask some questions in the comments. I don't know if I said that backwards before. Also, Lost Wolfling, were you the one that commented about getting Isildur as a tattoo? Because I think I seem to remember that causing quite a stir. So are the dwarves a slave race? No, the dwarves are not a slave race, Darkslayer. The dwarves would have been a kind of slave race if Eru, if the god in Tolkien's universe didn't take pity on them, didn't grant them consciousness. Because think about it like playing The Sims, right? Imagine playing The Sims 24/7, and imagine constantly having to have your mind on every single sim simultaneously, right? They have kind of free will, but if you're not actively playing, a sim there's gonna be problems with the sim. So if you think about it like that, you almost always have to be paying attention 24/7. It's a lot. I don't have any kids, but every parent I have ever said, or I've ever talked to, has said it's a lot like having children. You know, you're constantly on the watch, making sure that they don't hurt themselves. But think about it like this: if you're not thinking about it, then your creations, the dwarves themselves, would just be statues almost. Okay, Wolfling, thank you for the explanation. You will get Yeet tattooed, but you've already gone with Sindarin before. That's fair. That's fair. Why was Gandalf seen as weaker than Saruman if they were both Maiar? So it's less a question of who was strength and who was more the agreed upon leader. Maiar have different powers based on how they are formed, very similar to how people have different qualities when they're born, right? Some people are born and they have different strengths because of, genetics or something, but they're not necessarily stronger or weaker. And because of the different forms that they can take, the Maiar are more or less on equal power level. It just depends on what form they take in Middle-earth. Like a Balrog and Gandalf, they're on the same power level. Saruman, the Balrog, and Gandalf are all on the same power level. So they definitely could probably fight together. I don't necessarily know which one would win, though. We'll see. All right, I'm going to keep going. I'll take questions in a few minutes. So we just watched the creation of the dwarves. Then Aule took the 7 fathers of the dwarves and laid them to rest in far sundered places. And he returned to Valinor and waited while the long years lengthened. Since they were to come in the days of the power of Melkor, Aule made the dwarves strong to endure. Therefore they are stone-hard, stubborn, fast in friendship and in enmity, and they suffer toil and hunger and hurt of body more heartily than any other speaking peoples. And they live long, far beyond the span of men, yet not forever. Aforetime it was held among the elves in Middle-earth that dying the dwarves returned to the earth and the stone for which they were made. Yet that is not their own belief. For they say that Aule the Maker, whom they call Mahal, cares for them, and gathers them to Mandos in halls set apart, and that he declares to their fathers of old that Ilúvatar will hallow them, and give them a place among the children in the end. Then their part shall be to serve Aule and to aid him in the remaking of Arda after the last battle. They say also that the 7 fathers of the dwarves return to live again in their own kin and to bear once more their ancient names, of whom Durin was the most renowned in after ages, father of that kindred most friendly to the elves, whose mansions were called Khazad Dûm. For those that have seen the movies or know what Khazad Dûm is is the Mines of Moria. And I also want to point out something that is capitalized on here that might not get translated well over audio. I mentioned something about the dwarves shall serve Aule in something called the Last Battle. L and B are capitalized in that. So L in last and B in battle are capitalized. So the Last Battle, there's a name for it off the top of my head. I don't remember. I think it's Dragor Dragoloth. And the Last Battle is almost like, if you relate, I'll relate it to the Bible again, because Tolkien took so many cues from it. It is almost like the Book of Revelations. It is the final battle at the end of the world between Melkor and his forces and Eru and the forces of good. It literally is the final battle between the forces of good and evil. All right, let's keep going. Now, when Aule labored in the making of the dwarves, he kept this work hidden from the other Valar. But at last he opened his mind to Yavanna, his wife, and told her of all that had come to pass. Then Yavanna said to him, Eru is merciful. Now I see that thy heart rejoiceth, as indeed it may, for thou hast received not only forgiveness but bounty. Yet because thou hiddest this thought from me until its achievement, thy children will have little love for the things of my love. They will love first the things made by their own hands, as doth their father. They will delve in the earth, and the things that grow and live upon the earth they will not heed. Many a tree shall feel the bite of their iron without pity. But Aule answered, That shall also be true of the children of Iluvatar, for they will eat, and they will build, and though the things of thy realm have worth in themselves, and would have worth if no children were to come, yet Eru will give them dominion, and they shall use all that they find in Arda. Arda is the physical world, and Valinor, the Undying Lands, basically. Though not by the purpose of Eru, without respect or gratitude. Not unless Melkor darkens their hearts, said Yavanna. And she was not appeased, but grieved in heart, fearing what might be done upon Middle-earth in days to come. Therefore she went before Manwe, and she did not betray the counsel of Aule, but she said, King of Arda, is it true, as Aule hath said to me, that the children, when they come, shall have dominion over all the things of my labor, to do as they will therewith? It is true, said Manwe. But why dost thou ask? For thou hast no need of the teachings of Aule. Then Yavanna was silent, and looked into her own thought, and she answered, Because my heart is anxious, thinking of the days to come. All my works are dear to me. Is it not enough that Melkor should have marred so many? Shall nothing that I have devised be free from the dominion of others? If thou hast thy will, what wouldest thou reserve? Said Manwe. Of all thy realm, what dost thou hold dearest? Keep listening, guys. This is one of my favorite parts. All have their worth, said Yavanna, but each contributes to the worth of the others. But the Kevlar can flee or defend themselves, whereas the Olvar that grow cannot. And among these I hold trees, dear. Long in the growing, swift shall they be in the felling, and unless they pay toll with fruit upon bough, little mourned in their passing. So I see in my thought, would that these trees might speak on behalf of all things that have root, and punish those that wrong them. That is a strange thought, said Manwe. Yet it was in the song, said Yavanna. For while thou wert in heavens, and with Ulmo built the clouds and poured out the rains, I lifted up the branches of great trees to receive them, and some sang to Iluvatar amid the wind and the rain. Then Manwe sat silent, and thought of Yavanna, as she had put into his heart grew as... Oh, excuse me, let me start that over again. Then Manwe sat silent, and the thought of Yavanna that she had put into his heart grew and unfolded, and it was beheld by Iluvatar. Then it seemed to Manwe that the song rose once more about him, and he heeded how many things therein, that though he had heard them, he had not heeded before. And at last the vision was renewed, but it was not now remote, for he was himself within it, and yet he saw that all was upheld by the hand of Iluvatar, and the hand entered in, and from it came forth many wonders, that had until then been hidden from the hearts of the Ainur. So I'll pause there very briefly, because there's a lot of flowery language there, but not a lot of explanation about what just happened. What you just witnessed was Yavanna coming up with the idea for guardians of the forest to protect the trees. If that sounds familiar, that's because that's what Ents are. Treebeard. All of the walking, talking trees that we see. And in the process of Yavanna going to Manwe, the king of the Valar, she says, all of the other things that were created are going to destroy the things that I created. I don't want that. And so Aule, creating the dwarves, sparks Yavanna to try and create something to not necessarily life, but like a guardian, some sort of sentient thing that can help protect the things that she loves. And in doing so, she goes to Manwe, and Manwe says, all right, I'll talk with God about it. And when he does, he sees, oh, yep, this was always part of the plan. Let's make those tree guardians. And here it comes. Then Manwe awoke, and he went down to Yavanna upon Izelohar, and he sat beside her beneath the two trees. And Manwe said, O Kementari, and Kementari is another name for Yavanna. O Kementari, Eru hath spoken, saying, do then any of the Valar suppose that I did not hear all of the song, even the least sound of the least voice? Behold, when the children awake, then the thought of Yavanna will awake also, and it will summon spirits from afar, and they will go among the Kelvar and the Olvar, and some will dwell therein and be held in reverence, and their just anger shall be feared. For a time, while the firstborn are in their power, and while the secondborn are young. The firstborn are the elves, the secondborn are men. Humans, rather. But dost thou not now remember, Kementari, that thy thought sang not always alone? Did not thou thought and mine also meet, so that we took wing together, like great birds, and soar above the clouds? That also shall come to be by the heed of Iluvatar. And before the children awake, there shall go forth with wings like the wind of the eagles and the lords of the west. Then Yavanna was glad, and she stood up, reaching her arms towards heaven, and said, high shall climb the trees of Kementari, that the eagles of the king may house therein. But Manwe rose also, and it seemed that he stood to such a height that his voice came down to Yavanna as from the paths of the wind. Nay, he said, only the trees of Aule will be tall enough. In the mountains the eagles shall house, and hear the voices of those who call upon us. But in the forest shall walk the shepherds of the trees. Then Manwe and Yavanna parted for a time. And Yavanna returned to Aule, and he was in his smithy pouring molten metal into a mold. Eru is bountiful, she said. Now let thy children beware, for there shall walk a power in the forest, whose wrath they will arouse at their peril. Nonetheless, they will have need of wood, said Aule, and he went on with his smith work. That is the end of chapter 2 of Aule and Yavanna. We just witnessed the creation of the dwarves and the Ents. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments section below. I noticed a few people already answering questions already. Thank you. Very kind of you. In the meantime, I'm going to pause briefly, take a quick 1-minute water break. Feel free to type in your questions now. I will be back in just a minute. And we're back. Thanks, everybody. So, let's take some questions. Here we go. So, Batty Cakes asks, so not all of the trees around Isengard were Ents? So, the Ents themselves, there's two types of trees. There's the Guardians, and then there's the Huorns. And the Huorns are trees that can't talk. So, not all of the trees were Ents, no. The actual guardians of the forest were the Ents like Treebeard and Quickbeam and you know what, off the top of my head I don't remember the names of other Ents. I'll have to correct that soon. Who is the oldest Ent? You know what, I'm not entirely sure. I'd want to say it's probably Treebeard. We'll see. Is Old Man Willow an Ent? Yeah, I think Old Man Willow might be an Ent. Him and Tom Bombadil seem to be, if you've read the books, Old Man Willow and Tom Bombadil have a sort of back and forth. And yeah, they go back and forth together. Why are the Maiar wizards? So not all Maiar are wizards. I want to say how do I describe this? So not all the Maiar are wizards. The 5 wizards took the form, the 5 wizards who are Maiar took the form of old men to try and help people of Middle-earth to defeat Sauron. And in doing so, they took the form of old men to seem trustworthy, and they are. But Maiar can take other forms. Balrogs. Some people think the fell beasts are Maiar, but I don't think that's true. Evil Shenanigans said, not a question, but thanks to one of your videos about Gandalf's age, you have deemed the new year the year of Gandalf. 2021, the year of Gandalf. I can get behind that. Who was the most powerful of Melkor's kind? So Melkor is a Valar, and the most powerful Valar is Melkor. But he has, I want to say, some equals in some way. So Manwë, who we just heard from in the book, is probably the second most powerful Valar, but it is definitely a toss-up. Melkor is probably stronger in some parts. Pudding Cup, you did not miss the creation of men yet. So no, We have not seen the creation of men. How come the Ents didn't know the trees were being cut down? So the Ents aren't like all-knowing. They can only be at one place at one time. They guard the forests, but they've been around a really long time. So I always like to think that the Ents kind of get distracted sometimes. Their job is to take care of the trees, but as their population of men increased and dwarves kept cutting them down and orcs kept cutting them down, they couldn't be everywhere at once. A lot of the trees in the forests survived because of the Ents and the mysticism surrounding them for thousands of years. But there's only so much that they can do, and eventually I think they just lost the ability to survive only on their reputation alone. Lost Wolfling says, Gandalf calls Treebeard the oldest living thing in one of the books. Do we know how death works for Ents? So, yeah, Treebeard probably is the oldest living thing in Middle-earth. I don't know if he is the oldest Ent, though. Do we know about the death of Ents, though? I don't know if an Ent's spirit survives. It's unclear at this point. Maybe that is explained in more of his unpublished works. I'll have to take a look at that. Why did Saruman take the side with Sauron? So, Crushed Ice, that is a good question. Sauron got tempted by power. The idea of being the ultimate ruler of Middle-earth is a very attractive idea for someone that likes power. So he sided with Sauron, not necessarily to be his servant, but almost to say, like, hey, maybe I can overthrow Sauron, you know? Keep your friends close, enemies closer kind of way. But he also acted as a servant to help Sauron to get rid of all of the people that oppose him. Redhead Sid asks, are there any more Maiar that we know of besides the wizards? Yes, we know of a few. And we have a few that are speculated to be Maiar, but are never actually confirmed. Those will come up in various readings. Which copy of the Silmarillion do I have? Chicken, that is a good question. Off the top of my head, I have the Mariner Books Huffington Mifflin Harcourt version from, I believe this is 2000 and... Oh, you know what? This is second edition. I apologize. So this is the second edition of the Silmarillion, but it is a paperback copy published by Mariner. All right. So Ginger asks, so Eru made the Valar and Melkor turned against him? Yes. Think about it. I'll relate this in terms of Christianity because that is what Tolkien drew a lot of his inspiration from. God created the angels, and then Lucifer, the angel, became corrupted and turned against him. And in a similar way, Eru, or Iluvatar, the god in Tolkien's universe, created the Ainur, which are like the lesser gods, and Melkor turned against him. Sam says that your mom is here. Hi, Sam's mom. All right. I am going to keep going. That was chapter 2. We are going to start with chapter 3 again. And chapter 3 is a little bit longer. It's about 8 pages. And it is of the coming of the elves and the captivity of Melkor. So you can kind of guess what happens a little bit. Melkor is going to get his comeuppance. Maybe. For now. We'll see. All right, here we go. Chapter 3, of the coming of elves and the captivity of Melkor. Through long ages the Valar dwelt in bliss in the light of the trees beyond the mountains of Aman. But all Middle-earth lay in a twilight under the stars. While the lamps had shone, growth began there, which now was checked, because all was again dark. Brief aside. You'll remember last time we were here, the lamps that were created by the Valar as a source of light in Middle-earth were destroyed by the evil Valar, Melkor. They are gone. So Middle-earth is in relative darkness. But already the oldest living things had arisen. In the seas, the great weeds, and on earth, the shadow of great trees, and in the valleys of the night-clad hills, there were dark creatures old and strong. To those lands and forests the Valar seldom came, save only Yavanna and Orome. Orome is one of the other Valar. And Yavanna would walk there in the shadow, grieving, because the growth and promise of the spring of Arda was stayed, meaning it was paused. And she set asleep upon many things that had arisen in the spring, so that they should not age, but should wait for a time of awakening that yet should be. But in the north Melkor built his strength, and he slept not, but watched and labored. And the evil things that he had perverted walked abroad, and the dark and slumbering woods were haunted by monsters and shapes of dread. And in Utumno is the place where Melkor is hiding in Middle-earth, the northern part of Middle-earth. And in Utumno he gathered his demons about him, whose spirits who first adhered to him in the days of his splendor, and became most like him in his corruption. Their hearts were of fire, but they were cloaked in darkness, and terror went before them. They had whips of flame. Balrogs they were named in Middle-earth in latter days. And in that dark time Melkor bred many other monsters, of diverse shapes and kinds, that long troubled the world, and his realm spread now ever southward over Middle-earth. That is the first description we get of Balrogs. And Melkor made also a fortress and armory not far from the northwestern shores of the sea, to resist any assault that might come from Aman. Aman is the other continent, the Undying Lands. And that stronghold was commanded by Sauron, lieutenant of Melkor, and it was named Angband. Angband. He creates a fortress called Angband. That's going to come up a while. It would do well to remember that. It came to pass that the Valar held council, for they became troubled by the tidings that Yavanna and Orome brought from the outer lands. And Yavanna spoke before the Valar, saying, Ye mighty of Arda, the vision of Ilúvatar was brief, and soon taken away, so that maybe we cannot guess within a narrow count of days the hour appointed. Yet be sure of this, the hour approaches. And within this age our hope shall be revealed, and the children shall awaken. Shall we then leave the lands of their dwelling desolate and full of evil? Shall they walk in darkness while we have light? Shall they call Melkor Lord, while Manwë sits upon Taniquetil? So Taniquetil, just as a reminder, Taniquetil is the mountain that the Valar live on. It's basically like their kingdom, their throne, palace area, I want to say. That name comes up a few times, and there are different names for it. So I always want to make sure that I explain the better names. And Tulkas is another one of the Valar, and Tulkas cried, Nay, let us make war swiftly. Have we not rested from strife over long? And is not our strength now renewed? Shall one alone contest with us forever? But at the bidding of Manwë, Mandos spoke. Mandos is another one of the Valar. And he said, In this age the children of Ilúvatar shall come indeed, but they come not yet. Moreover, it is doom that the firstborn shall come in the darkness, and shall look first upon the stars. Great light shall be for their waning. To Varda ever shall they call at need. So the Valar here are arguing. Do we fight Melkor? We want a good life for the elves eventually, but we need to fight Melkor if that's going to happen anytime soon, and so they're going back and forth. Let's continue. Then Varda went forth from the council, and she looked out upon the heights of Taniquetil, and beheld the darkness of Middle-earth beneath the innumerable stars, faint and far. Then she began a great labor, greatest of all the works of the Valar since their coming into Arda. She took the silver dews from the vats of Telparion, and therewith she made new stars, and brighter against the coming of the firstborn. Telparion, if you'll remember, was one of the trees that Yavanna created to be a light source for the Undying Lands. There is another tree called Laurelin, which has, I believe, a more golden glow. But Telparion and its dew just created the stars. Wherefore, she whose name out of the depths of time and labor of Ea was Tintale, the kindler, was called after by the elves Elentari, queen of the stars, Carnil and Luinil, Nanar and Lumbar, Alcarinque and Elamire she wrought in that time, and many others of the ancient stars she gathered together and set as signs in the heavens of Arda. I'll pause there for a second because this is one of those times when Tolkien uses a lot of names and it gets very confusing. Tolkien just gave us the names of several of the stars that were created from the dew of the magical tree. So the names are Tintale, Elentari, Carnil, Lunil, Nanar, and Lumbar, Alcarinque, and Elamire. I might be pronouncing these incorrectly. There are a lot of accents that I don't understand on here. I need to double check that. But the important part is to know that stars were created, so that Middle-earth wasn't in total darkness. There was some light. Let's continue. Oh, here we go. These are the signs in the heavens of Arda. Wilwarren, Telumendil, Soranume, Anarima, and Menelmakar with his shining belt that forebodes the last battle that shall be the end of days. And high in the north, as a challenge to Melkor, she set the crown of the 7 mighty stars to swing. Valakirka, the sickle of the Valar, and a sign of doom. It is told that even as Varda ended her labors, and they were long, when first Menelmakar strode up the sky, and the blue fire of Helluin flickered in the mists above the borders of the world. In that hour, the children of the earth awoke, the firstborn of Ilúvatar. By the starlight, mere of Cuiviénen, water of awakening, they rose from the sleep of Ilúvatar, and while they dwelt yet, silent by Cuiviénen, their eyes beheld first of all things the stars of heaven. Therefore they have ever loved the starlight, and have revered Varda Elentari above all the Valar. I'll make a brief note. For those that have read the original trilogy, there are a few scenes where the elves cry out the name Elbereth, Elbereth, I believe is the spelling. And Elbereth is the other name for Yavanna, the Valar that just created the stars and the constellations. And the elves basically worship her because her starlight is the first thing they see and the reason for their awakening. So I'll pause there. I'm about 2 pages in. If anyone has any questions, feel free to write them down in the comments section below, because this is where we finally get to see the beginning of elves. And it is fun. And next chapter, we get to learn about one of the elves, who's not... One of the elves is important in this book, and his actions cause a lot of problems. Gotta make sure to stay hydrated. All right, so feel free to write some questions down in the question section below. All right, so Ginger Biscuit asks, surely Eru would best Melkor easily in the last battle. He created him. Yes, he would. And I think there's something to be said about why Eru doesn't just destroy Melkor. And I think the idea being that the creation of the world and the Ainur and everything in it, Eru has a plan for it. In the same way that many religious people believe that their deity, their god, has a plan for them. Tolkien is drawing a lot of inspiration here from Catholicism, Christianity. There's a lot of parallels that you can see. And I think the idea throughout the entirety of the Silmarillion is, yes, God could probably just take care of all of this, but that's not the point. The point is for his creations, the Ainur, the Valar, the elves, men, dwarves, even hobbits, if you will. They're all going to come together, and maybe there is a final battle, and maybe it will be reborn, but Tolkien doesn't write about that, because it hasn't happened yet in that universe. All right. So elves woke up before Melkor was dealt with or even weakened. Oh, yes. Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one. So Iluvatar created elves and then Valar? So no. Iluvatar created Iluvatar created something called the Ainur. And the Ainur are literally the children of his thought, consciousness. The Valar were the Ainur that went down into the physical world of Middle-earth. It's called Ea. And in doing so, they became sort of like demigod. I'll call them lesser gods. And then the elves were created. But the elves were created by Iluvatar, not by the Valar and the Ainur. So the Valar kind of look at the elves as not their children, but the children of their god. And so they want to take care of the elves. So Charla asks, the elves wake up and not appear. They were already there. So you can kind of read into several interpretations of that. There are some people I've had discussions with that believe that the elves sort of materialized into existence. There's no real sort of chicken and egg debate here, right? The elves appeared, they woke up, whether or not their physical bodies were there and they were on the ground sleeping, or they were, a single cell organism that evolved and gained consciousness. It's not really clear. Tolkien doesn't really get into the sort of, I'll call it in air quotes, scientific parts of creation. The elves more metaphorically woke up. They had consciousness, and the first thing they saw was the stars. So that's how we get that. All right, I'm going to keep going. Let's continue of the coming of the elves. In the changes of the world, the shapes of lands and seas have been broken and remade. Rivers have not kept their course, neither have mountains remained steadfast. and to Cuiviénen there is no returning. But it is said among the elves that it lay far off in the east of Middle-earth and northward, and it was a bay in the inland sea of Helcar. And that sea stood there aforetime the roots of the mountain of Iluin had been before Melkor overthrew them. Many waters flowed down thither from heights in the east, and the first sound that was heard by the elves was the sound of water flowing, and the sound of water over falling stones. Long they dwelt in their first home by the water under the stars, and they walked the earth in wonder, and they began to make speech and give names to all things that they perceived. Themselves they named the Quendi. So Quendi is another word for elf, signifying those that speak with voices, for as yet they had met no other living thing that spoke or sang. And on a time it chanced that Orome, one of the Valar, rode eastward in his hunting, and he turned north by the shores of Helcar and passed under the shadow of the Oracarni, the mountain of the east. Then, on sudden, Nahar, his horse, set up a great neighing, and stood still. And Orome wondered and sat silent. And it seemed to him that in the quiet of the land under the stars he heard afar off many voices singing. Thus it was that the Valar found at last, as it were by chance, those whom they had so long awaited. And Orome, looking upon the elves, was filled with wonder, as though they were beings sudden and marvelous and unforeseen. For so it shall ever be with the Valar. From without the world, though all things may be forethought in music or foreshadow in the visions from afar, to those who enter verily into Ea, each in its time shall be met at unawares as something new and unforetold. In the beginning, the elder children of Iluvatar were stronger and greater than they have since become, but not more fair. For though the beauty of the Quendi kind of sounds like Wendy's, doesn't it? Sorry, brief aside. Oh, did someone make that joke? Lost Wolfling. Sir, this is a Quendi's. That's great. Sorry, I get distracted by comments sometimes. So, in the beginning, the elder children of Iluvatar were stronger and greater than they have since become, but not more fair. For though the beauty of the Quendi in the days of their youth was beyond all other beauty that Iluvatar had caused to be, it has not perished, but lives in the west, and sorrow and wisdom have enriched it. And Orome loved the Quendi, and named them in their own tongue Eldar, the people of the stars. But that name was afterborne only by those who followed him upon the westward road. Yet many of the Quendi were filled with dread at his coming, and this was the doing of Melkor. For by after-knowledge the wise declared that Melkor, ever watchful, was first aware of the awakening of the Quendi, and sent shadows and evil spirits to spy among them and waylay them. So it came to pass some years ere the coming of the Orome, that if any of the elves strayed far abroad, alone or few together, they would often vanish and never return. And the Quendi said that the hunter had caught them, and they were afraid. And indeed, the most ancient songs of the elves, which echoes are still remembered in the West, tell of the shadow shapes that walked in the hills above Cuiviénen, or would pass suddenly over the stars, and of the dark rider upon his wild horse that pursued those that wandered to take them and devour them. Now Melkor greatly hated and feared the riding of Orome, and either he sent indeed his dark servants as riders, or set lying whispers abroad, for the purpose that the Quendi should shun Orome, if they ever should meet. So here we see Melkor continuing his falsehoods. He is laying lies and sending out his own riders to try and scare the elves, so that if Orome ever does come, they're like, no, we don't like you. We don't like the Valar. That way, his plan, I think, eventually was to come corrupt the elves, which he partially succeeds at. But that's a different story for another time. Let's continue. Thus it was that when Nahar, Nade, and Orome came among them, some of the Quendi hid themselves, and some fled and were lost. But those that had courage and stayed perceived swiftly that the great rider was no shape out of darkness, for the light of Aman was in his face, and all the noblest of the elves were drawn to it. But those unhappy ones who were ensnared by Melkor, little is known of a certainty, so we don't really know what happened to them. For who of the living has descended into the pits of Autumno, or has explored the darkness of the councils of Melkor? Yet this is held true by the wise of Erisea, that all those of the Quendi who came into the hands of Melkor ere Autumno was broken were put there in prison, and by slow arts of cruelty were corrupted and enslaved. Thus did Melkor breed the hideous races of the orcs, in envy and mockery of the elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foe. For the orcs had life, and multiplied after the manner of the children of Ilúvatar, and naught that had life of its own, nor the semblance of life, could ever Melkor make since his rebellion in the Ainulindale before the beginning. So say the wise. And deep in the dark hearts of the orcs, and deep in their dark hearts the orcs loathed the master whom they served in fear, the maker only of their misery. This, it may be, was the vilest deed of Melkor, and the most hateful to Ilúvatar. So I'll pause there again. That is the creation story of the orcs. And I've said previously that we don't actually know where orcs come from. So that is one version of where orcs come from in a published work. There are a couple of others that exist in letters that Tolkien sent and notes that he wrote. It's also important to remember that the Silmarillion, while it is written by J.R.R. Tolkien, is a collection of notes and drafts published after his death by his son. So I am of the opinion that orcs are corrupted elves, and I still hold to that. But there are people in the Lord of the Rings community that don't necessarily agree with that assumption. And that's fair. They can think whatever they want. If you go down the where do orcs come from, you get a lot of, there's a big rabbit hole there. So Ginger asks, when and who created the Hobbits? So we don't have a lot of history about Hobbits and their creation. So it's not a question of who created them. Also, Pudding, thank you for coming. Thanks for dropping by. See ya. So we think Hobbits are descended from men, whether that was a dwarf or a dwarf and a human that fell in love, or just shorter humans, or natural evolution. It's not terribly clear. I'll probably have to make a video about that eventually on TikTok. I believe reading something that the Hobbits were happy accidents. Yeah, that does ring a bell. I don't remember off the top of my head where that comes from, though. I'll have to double check. You've given me a good video idea. Thank you both. All right. I am going to keep going, if that is okay with everybody else. So you just witnessed the creation of orcs. Oh, hang on. We've got some more questions. Sorry. Thor says, my wife wants to make potatoes for breakfast. Should we boil them, mash them, or stick them in a stew? Ooh. So, boiled potatoes for breakfast doesn't sound too great. Mashed potatoes for breakfast, I mean, I've done it before, full disclosure. Sticking them in a stew is more a dinner. I would cut them up, put a little bit of sea salt and rosemary on them, and have breakfast potatoes. That's just me, though. You do what you want. Do the hobbits have a normal lifespan? Normal is in quotes. So, Poe, I will say that hobbits' lifespan is more along the lines of, like, later than humans in, like, the 100 to 110-ish. Bilbo was the oldest hobbit. And at the end of The Return of the King, I believe he is 128 or 129. That's exactly what she's... So Thor says that's... Your wife says that's exactly what she's going to do. Thor, I'm glad. Good. So Frodo... Yeah, so Lost Wolfling. Frodo is kind of like a teenager. The coming of age for hobbits is 33 years old. So Frodo's not necessarily a teenager per se, but it's when they are fully matured, fully developed. They have longer time than us to develop. But he is 50 by the time he leaves for Rivendell. Evil Shenanigans is giving you some recommendations. Thor, cube and fry the potatoes, cook up some sausage, scramble some eggs, and you've got a breakfast casserole. That sounds delicious, actually. Is anybody else hungry? I am. All right, I'm going to keep going, because I've got 45 minutes to finish 3.5 pages. We should be fine, I hope. All right, so when we left off, Orome was just meeting the elves. Orome tarried a while among the Quendi, and then swiftly he rode back over land and sea to Valinor, and brought the tidings to Valmar. Valmar is the place where the Valar live. And he spoke of the shadows that troubled Cuiviénen. Then the Valar rejoiced, and yet they were in doubt amid their joy. And they debated long what counsel it was best to take for the guarding of the Quendi from the shadow of Melkor. But Orome returned at once to Middle-earth and abode with the elves. Manwë sat long in thought upon Taniquetil, and sought the counsel of Ilúvatar. And coming then down to Valmar, he summoned the Valar to the Ring of Doom, and thither came even Ulmo from the outer seas. Ulmo is one of the Valar who is basically the Poseidon character. And if you remember from last time, if you were here, Ulmo doesn't come to hang out with the other Valar unless it is very important. So when Ulmo shows up, you know things are about to happen. Then Manwë said to the Valar, "This is the counsel of Ilúvatar in my heart, that we should take up again the mastery of Arda, at whatsoever cost, and deliver the Quendi from the shadow of Melkor." Then Tulkas was glad, but Aule was grieved, foreboding the hurts of the world that must come from the strife. But the Valar made ready, and came forth from Aman in strength of war, resolving to assault the fortress of Melkor and make an end. Never did Melkor forget that this war was made for the sake of the elves, and that they were the cause of his downfall. Yet they had no part in those deeds, and they know little of the riding of the might of the West against the North in the beginning of their days. Melkor met the onset of the Valar in the northwest of Middle-earth, and all that region was much broken. But the first victory of the host of the west was swift, and the servants of Melkor fled before them into Autumno. Then the Valar passed over Middle-earth, and they set a guard over Cuiviénen, and therefore the Quendi knew nothing about the battle of the powers, save that the earth shook and groaned beneath them, and the waters were moved, and in the north there were lights as of many fires. Long and grievous was the siege of Autumno, and many battles were fought before its gates, of which naught but rumor is known to the elves. In that time the shape of Middle-earth was changed, and the great sea that sundered it from Aman grew wide and deep, and it broke upon the coasts and made a deep gulf in the southward. Many lesser bays were made between the great gulf and the Helcarax far to the north, where Middle-earth and Aman came together. The Helcarax is a sheet of ice that connected the two continents together. We'll come back to the Helcarax soon. Of these, the Bay of Balar was chief, and into it the mighty river Sirion flowed down from the newly raised highlands northward. Dorthonion and the mountains of Hithlim, the lands of the far north, were all made desolate in those days. For there Autumno was delved exceeding deep, and its pits were filled with fire, and with great hosts of the servants of Melkor. But at the last the gates of Autumno were broken, and the halls unroofed, and Melkor took refuge in the uttermost pits. Then Tulkas stood forth as champion of the Valar and wrestled with him, and cast him upon his face, and he was bound with the chains of Anganor that Aule had wrought, and led captive, and the world had peace for a long age. I'll pause there briefly for a second. That is one of my favorite parts of the Silmarillion. Tolkien is not necessarily the best at writing his battles, per se, and I think there are stronger writers about the intricacies of battle, but Tolkien was never focused on the fighting itself. The fighting was sort of an afterthought. But we just read about the Valar absolutely destroying Melkor's fortress, Melkor's forces, and all the while the elves have no idea. The elves have no idea what's going on. There are fires in the north, and there are earthquakes and natural disasters, and everything is changing around them. And they don't know what's happening, because the Valar are going to war against Melkor for their sake. Alright, I'll take a couple of questions. Could anyone be more powerful with the One Ring than Sauron was? Ginger, I don't think so. I think because Sauron made the ring, and it answers to him alone, you could have power if you put on the One Ring, but I don't think it would make anyone more powerful than Sauron, because it does just kind of heighten your natural abilities. It does other things as well, but in a way, it kind of levels you up, like in a video game. All right, I'm going to keep going. Nevertheless, the Valar did not discover all the mighty vaults and caverns hidden with deceit far under the fortress of Angband and Autumno. Many evil things still lingered there, and others were dispersed and fled into the dark and roamed in the waste places of the world, awaiting a more evil hour. And Sauron they did not find. Uh-oh. But when the battle was ended, And from the ruin of the north great clouds arose and hid the stars. The Valar drew Melkor back to Valinor, bound hand and foot and blindfold. And he was brought to the Ring of Doom. There he lay upon his face before the feet of Manwë and sued for pardon, but his prayers were denied, and he was cast into prison in the fastness of Mandos, whence none can escape, neither Vala, nor elf, nor mortal man. Vast and strong are those halls, and they were built in the west of the lands of Aman. There was Melkor doomed to abide for 3 ages long, before his cause should be tried anew, or he should plead again for pardon. Then again the Valar were gathered in council, and they were divided in debate. For some, and of those Ulmo was the chief, held that the Quenti should be left free to walk as they would in Middle-earth, and with their gifts of skill in order all the lands and heal their hurts. But the most part feared for the Quenti in the dangerous world amid the deceit of the starlit dusk. And they were filled, moreover, with the love of the beauty of the elves, and desired their fellowship. So they want to be friends. And at last, therefore, the Valar summoned the Quenti to Valinor, there to be gathered at the knee of the powers in the light of the trees forever. And Mandos broke his silence, saying, "So it is doomed." From this summons came many woes that afterwards befell. I know I just took a break, but I want to pause there for a brief second because I want to talk about Mandos. Mandos is one of the Valar who is kind of the equivalent of Hades, but not evil. Mandos rules the place where elves go when they die, called the Halls of Mandos. And when Mandos speaks, and he doesn't always, but when Mandos speaks, it is usually in prophecy. And when prophecies happen, they are usually not very good, because the idea of Mandos being able to see the future is kind of up for debate. I've seen people go both ways on that one. But I think when Mandos speaks, it is a prophecy or a declaration of sorts. He is the sayer of what is. But there are other problems that are going to arise from this, and there's a huge debate as to whether or not what would have happened if the Valar had just left the elves alone. Because a lot of good things come out of what happens when the Valar and the elves meet, but also a lot of hurt. Oh, so I see in the comments someone saying Hades wasn't evil, and I think someone else said the Disney version. At that point, I kind of was referring to the Disney version, but also like as a lord of the when I refer to Mandos as Hades, he's like a lord of the underworld, but it's not the underworld, it's purgatory, and it's not evil, it's apathetic is maybe the right word to use. Okay, I'll take a question. Ginger asks, if I could ask Tolkien one question, where would it be? What would it be? I would like to know where the Entwives are. I just think the Entwives story is very sad. For those that don't know, all of the Ents that we see in the movies and in the books, they are all male. The male Ents lost their female counterparts, and they just didn't show up one day, and they haven't been able to find them since. And I always thought that was very sad. So I'd like to know where they are. Maybe Tolkien doesn't even know. All right, here we go. But the elves were at first unwilling to hearken to the summons, for they had as yet seen the Valar only in their wrath as they went to war, save Orome alone. And they were filled with dread. Therefore Orome was sent again to them, and he chose from among them ambassadors, who should go to Valinor and speak for their people. And these were Ingwe, Finwë, and Aule. Remember Finwë's name. Finwë is important. He's going to come up a lot. Who afterwards were kings. And coming, they were filled with awe by the glory and majesty of the Valar, and desired greatly the light and splendor of the trees. Then Orome brought... Oh, excuse me, I lost my place. Then Orome brought them back to Cuiviénen, and they spoke before their people, and counseled them to heed the summons of the Valar, and remove into the west. Then befell the first sundering of the elves, for the kindred of Ingwe, and the most part of the kindred of Finwë and Aule, were swayed by the words of their lords, and were willing to depart and follow Orome. And these were known after as the Eldar, by the name that Orome gave to the elves in the beginning, in their own tongue. But many refused the summons, preferring the starlight and wide spaces of Middle-earth to the rumor of the trees. And these are called the Avari, the unwilling. And they were sundered in that time from the Eldar, and met never again until many ages were past. The Eldar prepared now a great march from their first home in the east, and they were arrayed in 3 hosts. The smallest host, and the first was set forth, was led by Ingwe, the most high lord of all the elvish race. He entered into Valinor and sits at the feet of the powers, and all elves revere his name. But he never came back, nor looked again upon Middle-earth. The Vanyar were his people, and they were the fair elves, the beloved of Manwë and Varda, and few among men have spoken with them. So those are the elves that went to the Undying Lands, but never came back to Middle-earth. They are known as the Vanyar. Next came the Noldor, a name of wisdom, the people of Finwë. They are the Deep Elves, and friends of Aule, the guy who created the Dwarves. And they are renowned in song, for they fought and labored long and grievously in northern lands of old. The greatest host came last, and they are named the Teleri, for they tarried on the road, and were not wholly of a mind to pass from the dusk to the light of Valinor. In water they had great delight. And those that came at last to the western shore were enamored of the sea. The sea elves, therefore, they became in the land of Aman, the Falmari, for they made music besides the breaking waves. 2 lords they had, for their numbers were great. Elwë Singolo, which signifies grey mantle, and Olwë, his brother. These were the 3 kindreds of the Eldale, who passing at length into the uttermost west in the days of the trees are called the Calaquendi, the elves of light. But others of the Eldar, other elves, were who set out indeed upon the westward march, but became lost upon the road, or turned aside, or lingered in the shores of Middle-earth. For these were, for the most part, of the kindred of the Teleri, as it is told hereafter. They dwelt by the sea or wandered in the woods and mountains of the world, yet their hearts were turned towards the west. Those elves the Calaquendi called the Umanyar, since they came never to the land of Aman and the Blessed Realm. But the Umanyar and the Avari alike they call the Moriquendi, the elves of the darkness, for they never beheld the light that was before the sun and the moon. I'll take a quick break there. Anyone wants to ask questions, go ahead. I will take a few. I see there's a couple here. Who's more beautiful, dwarf women or elf women? Well, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, crushed ice. So that's a matter of opinion. Is Ingwe still alive? As far as we know, Divorce Horse, yeah, believe he is. So for those listening on the live, yes, I am wondering what is going on in chat, because it seems like there's a lot of shenanigans. Oh, thank you for the bits, Lost Wolfling. Very kind of you. Very kind of you. Yeah, I'm glad I can kind of help explain this to people. All right. I am just going to take another sip of water, and then we will probably hit the last... Oh, do I have more to go? Oh, I've got about another page and a half. Here we go. Here we go. It is told that when the host of the Eldar departed from Cuiviénen, Orome rode at their head upon Nahar, his white horse shod with gold, and passing northward about the Sea of Helkar, they turned towards the west. Before them great clouds hung still black in the north above the ruins of war, and the stars in that region were hidden. Then not a few grew afraid and repented and turned back and are forgotten. So not everybody made it. Long and slow was the march of the Eldar into the west, for the leagues of Middle-earth were uncounted, and weary and pathless. Nor did the Eldar desire to hasten, for they were filled with wonder at all that they saw. And by many lands and rivers they wished to abide, and though all were yet willing to wander, many feared rather their journey's end than hoped for it. Therefore, whenever Orome departed, having at times other matters to heed, they halted and went forward no more until he returned to guide them. And it came to pass that after many years of journeying in this manner, the Eldar took their course through a forest, and they came to a great river, wider than any had yet seen. And beyond it were mountains whose sharp horns seemed to pierce the realm of the stars. This river, it is said, was even the river which after was called Anduin the Great. That is a reference to the original trilogy. Anduin is the river that the Fellowship travels from. And was ever a frontier of the westlands of Middle-earth. But the mountains were the Hithligir. I'm going to mispronounce that, excuse me. But the mountains were the Hithligir, the towers of mist upon the borders of Eriador. Yet they were taller and more terrible in those days, and were reared by Melkor to hinder the riding of Orome. Now the Teleri abode long on the east bank of the river, and wished to remain there. But the Vanya and the Noldor passed over it, and Orome led them into the passes of the mountains. And when Orome was gone forward, the Teleri looked upon the shadowy heights, and were afraid. Then one arose in the host of Aule, which ever the hindermost of the land. Lenwe he was called. He forsook the westward march, and led away a numerous people, southward, down the great river, and they passed out of the knowledge of their kin until long years were past. Those were the Nandor, and they became a people apart, unlike their kin, save that they love water, and dwelt most besides the falls and running streams. Greater knowledge they had of living things, trees and herbs, birds and beasts, than all other elves. And in after years, Denethor, son of Lenwe, turned again west at last, and led a part of that people over the mountain into Beleriand ere the rising of the moon. I'll pause there again, and I apologize for the background noise. That is my heater. Unfortunately, the place with the best Wi-Fi is also the place next to my heating fan. So you might have just heard that there is a name, Denethor. And if that sounds familiar, it's because Tolkien likes reusing names. Denethor is a name used basically a few times. I believe it's 2 or 3. But this Denethor is not the same as the Denethor found in the original trilogy. It is just another name of Denethor. At length, the Vanyar and the Moldor came over Ered Luin, the Blue Mountains, between Eriador and the westernmost part of Middle-earth, which the elves after named Beleriand. And the foremost companies passed over the Vale of Sirion, and came down to the shores of the great sea between Drengist and the Bay of Balar. But when they beheld it, great fear came upon them, and many withdrew into the woods and highlands of Beleriand. Then Orome departed, and returned to Valinor to seek the counsel of Manwë, and left them. And the host of the Teleri passed over the misty mountains and crossed the wide lands of Eriador, being urged on by Elwë Singolo, for he was eager to return to Valinor and the lights that he had beheld, and he wished not to be sundered from the Noldor. But he had great friendship with Finwë their lord. Thus after many years the Teleri came at last over Ered Luin, into the eastern regions of Beleriand. There they halted, and dwelt a while, beyond the river Gelion. That is the end of Chapter 3 of the coming of the elves. So the elves just